The courtroom was packed that morning, sunlight filtering through tall, narrow windows and slicing across the polished oak benches. Reporters crowded near the back, their pens poised, their cameras flashing with anticipation. Everyone had come to see the young black woman who had dared to stand up against the system, a woman whose voice had shaken the courthouse walls just a week before. Her name was Amara Johnson, and although she looked calm, her hands trembled slightly as she stood in the defendant's box. She wasn't a criminal. She was a law graduate, a community advocate, and the sister of a man who had been wrongly arrested. But to the men in blue and the judge presiding that day, she was nothing more than a troublemaker. "Ms. Johnson," the judge began, his voice carrying the heavy arrogance of someone too long unchallenged, "you have been called here for contempt of court. Do you understand the charges against you?" Amara lifted her chin, her voice clear though her throat was tight. "I understand you're charging me for speaking the truth." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The judge's expression hardened. He had seen defiance before, but never like this. Not from someone like her, not from a young black woman who stood with such quiet confidence that it unsettled him. He slammed his gavel down. "Order!" Two uniformed officers stood beside Amara, their faces blank, their stances wide and intimidating. One of them, Officer Daniels, had been the same man who had arrested her brother a month earlier on false charges. He stared at her now with the faintest smirk, as if he were savoring her downfall. Amara's mind flashed back to that night. Her brother Malik had been walking home from his job when police stopped him, claiming he matched a description. They shoved him against a car, handcuffed him, and accused him of theft. It took Amara, with her deep knowledge of the law, to prove within hours that Malik had been at work the entire time. But even after he was released, no apology came. No accountability. Instead, they charged her for obstructing justice when she questioned their actions in court. Now, here she was, the victim of her own defense. "I will not stay silent while corruption hides behind your robes," Amara said, her voice shaking but resolute. "My brother was innocent and you know it. You dismissed the evidence because you didn't like who it came from." "Enough," the judge thundered, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. "You are here to answer for your behavior, not to lecture this court." "I'm here because I dared to ask for fairness," she replied, her tone low but cutting through the tension like glass. "And that's the real crime, isn't it?" Gasps filled the room. The judge's face turned crimson. He looked to the officers beside her. "Keep her quiet." Officer Daniels moved without hesitation. In one brutal motion, his hand shot out and, smack, struck Amara hard across the face. The sound echoed, snapping through the room like lightning. A hush fell. The air itself seemed to freeze. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Amara staggered slightly but caught herself on the wooden railing. The sting burned deep, but it wasn't just the slap that hurt. It was the humiliation, the audacity, the centuries of injustice contained in that one cruel gesture. The judge didn't reprimand him. He didn't even flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his gavel resting lazily in his hand, and said in a chillingly calm tone, "That's what happens when you forget your place. Ms. Johnson, her place." The word struck harder than the slap. Every muscle in her body tensed. The room swam with the heat of anger, disbelief, and shame. The cameras caught it all. The slap, the silence, the indifference. Reporters scribbled furiously, some too stunned to move. But then something shifted in Amara. Slowly, she straightened. Her eyes locked on the officer who had hit her, then on the judge who had allowed it. She raised her chin, her lip bleeding slightly but her expression unbroken. "You think that's going to silence me?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet powerful enough to cut through the stillness. "You think you can slap the truth out of me?" Daniels frowned, taken aback by her calmness. Amara continued, her gaze unwavering. "I have seen men like you all my life. Men who think power gives them permission to humiliate others. But here's what you don't understand. I don't need permission to fight back. You can hit me, you can arrest me, but you can't erase what's coming." The judge slammed his gavel again, shouting for order, but it was too late. The tension had already turned into something electric. Every journalist in the room was writing faster now, every camera flashing like lightning. Officer Daniels took a step forward, growling under his breath, "You'd better watch yourself." "Lady." Amara turned her head slowly toward him. "Oh, I'm watching," she said softly. And so was the whole world. The judge gestured to have her removed. The officers grabbed her by the arms, pulling her toward the exit. But as she was led away, she glanced back over her shoulder. "This isn't over," she said. "You're going to see me again. And when you do, you'll be standing where I am right now." Laughter rippled among the officers as they dragged her out. The judge leaned back with a scoff, muttering something about delusional activists. The room emptied slowly, conversations buzzing about the audacity of what had just happened. But they didn't know what Amara knew. They didn't know that outside those courthouse walls, the world was already reacting. The video clip of the slap had been recorded by multiple journalists and was spreading across social media within minutes. It was shocking, raw, and impossible to defend. By the time Amara sat in the holding area downstairs, her phone, which one kind officer had discreetly returned to her, was buzzing non-stop. Messages poured in. From friends, from professors, from journalists, from lawyers who wanted to represent her for free, from activists demanding justice. And somewhere between the flood of notifications and the dull throb of pain on her cheek, Amara smiled faintly, because what none of them realized, not even the officers who mocked her as she sat behind the metal bars, was that she had been on the verge of something monumental even before this day began. Just 2 weeks earlier, her name had been placed in nomination for an open judgeship in the state's 7th district. It was an unexpected opportunity, one she had almost turned down because she felt she wasn't ready. But her mentors had urged her to accept. They believed in her integrity, her brilliance, her fire, and now, this very incident, the slap, the injustice, the viral outrage, was about to ignite something far bigger than anyone could have predicted. As the hours passed, protests began forming outside the courthouse. Signs appeared with words like "Justice for Amara," "Stop courtroom abuse," and "She deserves the bench, not the chains." The footage of her being slapped had become the spark for a movement. Civil rights leaders spoke out on television. Senators demanded inquiries. The judge's conduct was condemned nationwide. Back in her cell, Amara sat quietly, her heart heavy but steady. She replayed the moment over and over. The slap, the silence that followed, the words, "Your place." She had spent her entire life fighting against those words, against a world that told her where she did and didn't belong. And now, for the first time, she realized the truth. Her place wasn't in the defendant's box. It was behind that bench, holding that gavel, making sure no one else would ever be silenced like she had been. Hours later, she was released on bail, greeted by a wall of cameras and supporters chanting her name. Her lawyer, a friend from law school, guided her through the crowd. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said quietly, touching the faint bruise on her cheek. "Better than fine. Amara, this video." "It's everywhere," he said. "You've started something. People are furious. The governor's office is already calling for a review of the case." Amara looked toward the courthouse steps in the same place where she had been humiliated just that morning and felt a strange calm settle over her. "Good," she said. "Let them see what justice really looks like." That night, she sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the messages of support. One email caught her eye. It was from the Judicial Review Board. Subject: Appointment Confirmation Update. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Ms. Johnson, in light of recent events and following a unanimous vote, the board has expedited your judicial confirmation hearing. Please be present this Friday morning to assume your official position as judge of the 7th District Court." Amara stared at the words for a long time. Her heart raced, her breath catching. In just a few days, she would be returning to that same courthouse, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as a judge. And the first case on her docket? The disciplinary hearing for the same officers who had assaulted her. Amara closed her eyes, the image of the courtroom flashing in her mind, the gavel, the smirk on Daniels's face, the arrogance of the judge who thought he could break her. "You'll regret that," she whispered, recalling her own words from that morning. Now it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Outside, the city buzzed with energy and outrage, and the story of the slapped woman who stood tall was on every news channel. But inside her small apartment, Amara sat quietly, the glow of her laptop illuminating her determined face. She wasn't celebrating, she was preparing. because in a few days she wasn't just walking back into that courtroom, she was taking the judge's seat. 3 days later, the courthouse that had once been filled with laughter at Amara's expense now stood in stunned, watchful silence. The same marble floors that had echoed with the sound of her being dragged away now carried a different rhythm, deliberate, commanding footsteps that belonged to her. The story of the slap heard around the court had become national news. The clip of Officer Daniels striking Amara was replayed on every television station, analyzed by legal experts and discussed by talk show hosts who couldn't believe what they had seen. The image of her calm defiance afterward had gone viral, a symbol of courage in the face of systemic cruelty. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse every day, chanting her name and demanding accountability. But what caught everyone by surprise was what happened next. The state's judicial review board had fast-tracked Amara's confirmation. Hearing after her nomination for judgeship resurfaced in the media. Overnight, what had been a quiet procedural appointment turned into a headline event. Thousands tuned in to watch live as the same woman who had been slapped in court just days earlier was sworn in as Judge Amara Johnson. Now, wearing the black robe of her office for the first time, she stood before the mirror in her chambers, the weight of history heavy on her shoulders. Her reflection looked different, not because of the robe or the title, but because of the resolve in her eyes. She touched her cheek gently where the bruise had been. It had almost faded, but she kept remembering the sound and the sting, the shock, the silence that had followed. She thought about all the people who had reached out since that day, victims of abuse, families wronged by the justice system, young law students inspired by her courage. She felt a responsibility far greater than the bench itself. There was a knock on the door. Her clerk, a soft-spoken young man named Ravi, stepped in. "Judge Johnson," he said with a respectful nod. "They're ready for you in courtroom 3. She took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "Thank you, Ravi." As she walked through the corridor, every head turned. Lawyers paused mid-conversation. Reporters whispered. The officers on duty stiffened. Some of them looked away, ashamed. Others stared, disbelief etched across their faces. The world seemed to slow as she approached the heavy double doors of the courtroom, the same courtroom where she had been humiliated just days earlier. The moment she stepped inside, every sound faded. It was as if time itself stopped. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked past the same wooden benches, past the same spot where she had stood bleeding, past the same officer who had struck her, now sitting in the front row. Pale and trembling, every seat was filled. The press had returned, cameras ready. Civil rights leaders sat alongside ordinary citizens who had come to witness what some were calling the most poetic moment in modern justice. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Amara Johnson." The sound of hundreds of people standing filled the room. For the first time in her life, those words, "all rise," weren't just ceremonial. They meant something. They were a statement, a correction, a rewriting of everything that had been wrong just a few days ago. Amara took her seat behind the bench, the judge's gavel resting before her. The wood was cold beneath her fingers, but it carried a strange warmth, the warmth of justice finally belonging to someone who had fought for it. "Please be seated," she said, her voice steady and controlled. The murmur of shuffling feet settled. The room fell silent again. In the front row sat Officer Daniels, his face tight with fear. Behind him were 2 more officers who had laughed the day she was slapped. To her left, lawyers from the department's Internal Affairs Division shuffled papers nervously. This was the disciplinary hearing, the first of many to come. She looked directly at the officer who had hit her. "Officer Daniels," she began, her tone measured but cutting. "You've been charged with misconduct, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights within this court. Do you understand the charges?" He cleared his throat, his voice barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." The words "Your Honor" trembled off his tongue, the irony hanging heavy in the air. "You assaulted a citizen in open court," Amara continued. "A citizen who posed no threat, who was exercising her constitutional right to speak." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. "Tell me, officer, did you think you would get away with it?" He swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. It was a mistake, ma'am. I was following orders." "Whose orders?" she asked, leaning slightly forward. The room went dead silent. Cameras zoomed in. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "The presiding judge told me to keep you quiet," he said at last, his voice cracking. Amara nodded slowly. "I see. And you believed that order gave you the right to hit someone?" He didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. She leaned back, taking a deep breath. "This court operates under the rule of law, not the rule of fear. The moment you raised your hand in violence, you violated not just your oath, but the very foundation of justice itself." Her words hung in the air, steady and powerful. The audience was rapt, the air thick with emotion. The proceedings continued for hours. Evidence was presented. Video footage from multiple angles, testimonies from reporters, statements from witnesses. Every frame told the same story. A woman humiliated, a system that stood silent, and an officer who acted without restraint. By midday, Amara called a recess. As she stepped out of the courtroom, the hallway erupted with reporters' questions. "Judge Johnson, how does it feel to be back in the same courtroom? Do you think the justice system can ever truly change? Will you seek criminal charges against the officers?" She paused only once, looking into the sea of microphones and flashing lights. "Change," she said quietly, "doesn't begin with anger. It begins with accountability." Her words made headlines within minutes. That evening, Amara sat alone in her office, reading over the case files stacked before her. Outside her window, the courthouse steps were illuminated by candlelight vigils, people holding signs, some crying, some praying. She thought about her parents, both civil rights activists who had marched decades earlier for the same justice she was now seated to deliver. She thought about her brother Malik, who still carried the trauma of being wrongfully arrested. She thought about every woman who had been told to stay quiet. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Ravi again, holding a folder. "Judge, we've received a statement from the governor's office," he said, handing it to her. She opened it and read quickly. The letter expressed public support for her leadership and announced a statewide review of courtroom procedures, including officer conduct within judicial chambers. Her actions, it said, had sparked a necessary reckoning. Amara set the letter down, exhaling slowly. She didn't feel pride, not yet. Just a deep sense of purpose. When court reconvened the next morning, the crowd was even larger. Every seat was filled, and a group of law students had gathered in the back, notebooks in hand, studying her every move. The air buzzed with anticipation. "Officer Daniels," she began again, "after reviewing all evidence, this court finds your actions to be an egregious abuse of authority. You will be relieved of duty, effective immediately, and barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity again." The officer's head dropped. His lawyer tried to object, but Amara silenced him with a single look. "This isn't punishment," she said softly. "It's protection. For every citizen who should never fear violence from those sworn to protect them." She turned her gaze to the gallery. "And let this serve as a message to anyone who believes the courtroom is a place for humiliation or silence. The courtroom is where the truth speaks, even when voices tremble." A wave of applause broke through the silence, the first aloud since the hearing began. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, sealing the moment in history. When Amara rose from the bench, the crowd stood too. Some people cried. Others simply clapped quietly, reverently. Even a few police officers saluted her as she walked past. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed. Protesters cheered as she emerged, flashes from cameras illuminating the night. One reporter pushed forward and shouted, "Judge Johnson, what do you say to those who claimed you'd never make it to this bench?" Amara stopped at the top of the steps and looked out over the crowd. The city lights glimmered behind them, and for a moment she thought of her younger self, the little girl from South Carolina who used to watch her father argue cases for people who couldn't afford lawyers. The girl who dreamed of fairness in a world that didn't want to give it. "I'd say they were right," she said, her voice calm but resonant. "I didn't make it here alone. Every person who ever spoke up and got silenced brought me here. Every injustice carried me. Every woman, every man, every soul who dared to say enough, they're the reason I'm sitting behind that bench." The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, chants of her name filled the square. As the noise faded, Amara turned to leave, her robe fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. The courthouse behind her gleamed under the streetlights, a symbol of power, once corrupted, now renewed. Inside, Officer Daniels sat alone in the empty courtroom, staring at the judge's bench. He could still hear her words echoing in his head. Justice has a strange way of coming full circle. And it had. Amara walked down the courthouse steps that night not as a victim, not as a symbol. The courthouse was quiet that morning, unusually still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The sun crept slowly across the marble floors, casting long golden streaks of light that fell over the benches and the empty witness stand. Judge Amara Johnson sat alone behind her desk in chambers, the weight of what was about to happen pressing heavily on her shoulders. Today wasn't just another day in court. It was the final chapter of something that had begun the moment she had been struck in this very building. Her gavel rested on the desk before her, polished smooth by her own hand. The same gavel that had once been used to silence her was now her symbol of power, her reminder that justice was not something handed out by those in charge. It was something fought for. She took a deep breath, looking out the window at the crowd gathering outside. Hundreds of people stood beyond the barricades, holding signs of support. Their chants echoed faintly through the glass. Justice for all. Judge Johnson. Her clerk Ravi entered quietly. The courtroom's full again, Judge, he said. Standing room only. Amara nodded, rising to her feet. I expected nothing less. She smoothed the front of her robe and looked at herself in the mirror one last time. Today isn't about me, Ravi, she said softly. It's about what this courtroom stands for from now on. When she stepped into the courtroom, every head turned. The sound of movement stopped instantly, replaced by the hush of anticipation. The crowd stood as she took her place behind the bench. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, and a few gasps rippled through the audience. The officer who had slapped her, Daniels, sat at the defendant's table looking exhausted. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain gray suit that suddenly seemed too big for him. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through papers with trembling hands. Please be seated, Amara said calmly, tapping the gavel once. The air was thick, heavy with tension. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would handle this moment whether she would let anger or justice lead. Officer Daniels, she began, her voice even, steady. This hearing is to determine sentencing for your actions witnessed not only by this court but by millions of people across the nation. He nodded slowly but didn't look up. Before we begin, she continued, I want to remind everyone present. This courtroom is not a stage for vengeance. It's a place of accountability. Her words settled over the room like a soft weight. She looked at the officer again. You've already been found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. Today I want to hear from you. In your own words, what do you have to say for yourself? The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, rubbing his palms together. He cleared his throat and finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. Your Honor, he said quietly, I can't defend what I did. I was angry. I was under pressure. You thought what? She interrupted gently. I thought I was doing my job, he said. The judge told me to keep you quiet. I didn't think. I just reacted. I'm sorry. The apology was hollow. Not cruel, not mocking, but empty. Like someone who regretted being caught more than he regretted what he had done. Amara leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him. You hit an unarmed woman in open court, she said slowly. You humiliated her in front of a room full of people, and now you're sorry because the world saw it. The man's eyes darted toward the cameras. Amara continued, her tone calm but sharp. Do you know what that slap meant, Officer Daniels? It wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever been told to stay in their place. It was every time the system raised a hand instead of a voice. She paused, letting her words sink in. You didn't just strike me. You struck at the heart of justice itself. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Even the cameras seemed to stop clicking. Then Amara spoke again, softer now. But justice isn't revenge, she said. And I refuse to let this bench become a weapon. I didn't fight my way here to mirror the cruelty that got me here. She turned to the attorneys present. This court will not seek to destroy a man, but to rebuild a system. The prosecutor looked confused. Your Honor, are you suggesting leniency? I'm suggesting justice, Amara replied. There's a difference. She looked back at Daniels. You'll lose your badge. You'll never serve as an officer again. But your punishment won't end there. You'll spend the next 5 years in community service under the Civil Justice Outreach Program. You'll work with the very communities you once intimidated. You'll listen to their stories. You'll teach children about the law you once abused. And you'll learn what real service means. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Surprise, disbelief, even admiration. Daniels blinked, clearly stunned. You're not sending me to prison? Amara's gaze didn't waver. Prison won't teach you what you need to learn. Shame won't change the world. Understanding will. And I want you to see firsthand what justice looks like when it protects rather than punishes. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then stopped, tears welling in his eyes. For the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful. Amara turned to the audience. This case isn't about one man's violence, she said, her voice ringing through the chamber. It's about a system that taught him it was acceptable. The true change begins when we stop seeing people as enemies and start holding institutions accountable. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. Every word she said would make headlines before the day was over. But as Amara continued, her voice grew softer, more personal. The day I was slapped in this courtroom, I felt powerless for a moment. But then I realized, power doesn't come from fear. It comes from truth. And truth doesn't need permission to speak. The room was silent. Even the air felt still. She raised the gavel and brought it down once, firm, final. Court is adjourned. As she stood, the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, some with tears streaming down their faces. The reporters rushed forward, shouting her name, asking questions, their cameras flashing wildly. But Amara didn't stop to answer. She simply nodded politely and stepped down from the bench. As she walked toward the exit, she passed Daniels, who stood shakily, his eyes downcast. He whispered, barely audible, "Thank you, Judge." She paused for a heartbeat, then nodded once. "Make it count," she said quietly and walked away. Outside, the courthouse plaza was overflowing with people. Flags waved, voices rose, and banners bearing her name filled the air. The energy was electric. Not the rage-fueled fire of protest, but something purer, stronger. Hope. As she descended the courthouse steps, reporters surged forward, microphones raised. "Judge Johnson, how does it feel knowing you've made history?" one called out. She stopped at the base of the stairs, surrounded by cameras, lights flashing in her eyes. For a moment she said nothing, just gazed out at the sea of faces, young, old, black, white, hopeful. Then she smiled. "It doesn't feel like I made history," she said finally. "It feels like history finally listened." The crowd erupted. Applause rolled like thunder. People chanted her name again and again, their voices echoing off the courthouse walls. That night, Amara returned to her apartment, exhausted but at peace. She kicked off her heels, hung her robe neatly on the back of a chair, and stood by the window looking out over the city lights. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel since her brother's arrest. Calm. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her brother Malik. "You did it, sis. You didn't just win. You changed something real." She smiled softly, typing back, "We did it." Across town in a small community center, a group of young law students were huddled around a TV, watching her speech replay. They took notes, their eyes wide with admiration. One of them whispered, "That's the kind of judge I want to be." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels sat alone in his car outside the courthouse. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, tired, broken, but somehow lighter. He replayed her words in his head, "Understanding will." For the first time, he thought about what that meant. Maybe this wasn't the end for him. Maybe somehow it was a beginning. Weeks passed. Amara's courtroom became a symbol of change. Cases of racial misconduct were reviewed. Officers were retrained. The governor announced a Justice for All Reform Act, inspired by her ruling. But for Amara, the biggest change wasn't in the headlines or the policies. It was in the people who came before her bench. Citizens who now walked in not with fear, but with faith. Faith that justice, at least in her courtroom, would not be blind to truth. Months later, a young girl approached her outside the courthouse, about 12 years old, clutching a notebook to her chest. "Judge Johnson?" she said timidly. Amara smiled. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl's eyes shone. "I saw what you did. My mom says you're brave. I want to be like you when I grow up." Amara knelt, looking into her eyes. "You already are," she said. "Bravery isn't about fighting. It's about standing when the world tells you to sit." The girl nodded, smiling shyly before running back to her mother. As Amara stood and looked up at the courthouse, she felt the wind stir her robe, the sun warm her face. She thought of that first day, the humiliation, the slap, the silence. And now the same space was alive with light, laughter, and justice. She walked up the steps again, her heels clicking softly against the stone. Inside, the courtroom awaited her, but it wasn't the same place anymore. It was transformed.